History is often written by the victors, but it is bled for by the fathers who leave their homes behind. Meet Elias Thorne, a simple farmer forced to trade his plow for a musket when the drums of war shatter the peace of his valley. From the freezing silence of a starving winter to the fiery chaos of the front lines, witness the brutal price of liberty and the power of a midnight promise. Will he survive the darkness to see his family again? If you love immersive historical stories, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more. Close your eyes, relax, and let's step back into history. The wind howled across the Shenandoah Valley, carrying with it the scent of rain and the heavier metallic tang of impending violence. Elias Thorne stood at the edge of his cornfield, wiping the sweat from his brow with a rough linen handkerchief, watching the dark clouds bruise the horizon in the west, where the sun usually set in a blaze of orange and gold, but today there was only gray. The air felt thick with humidity and unspoken fears that had been plaguing the settlement for weeks, making the simple act of breathing feel like a labor. Elias had spent 40 years on this land, carving a life out of the wilderness with his bare hands and the strength of his back, turning wild forests into rows of swaying corn and wheat that fed not only his family but half the town of Oakhaven. He remembered when the biggest threat was a harsh winter or a pack of wolves, but now the threats wore red coats and spoke of taxes and loyalty to a distant crown that cared little for the men and women bleeding into the American soil. A hawk circled overhead, screeching a lonely cry that echoed against the silence of the impending storm, and Elias took it as an omen, because in these times men looked for signs in everything from the flight of birds to the way tea leaves settled in a cup. He turned back toward the farmhouse, a sturdy structure of timber and stone that had sheltered 3 generations of Thornes, seeing the warm glow of a lantern in the kitchen window where his wife Sarah was likely preparing the evening meal, unaware that the world outside was tilting on its axis. As he walked, the dry earth crunched beneath his boots, a sound that seemed too loud in the stillness, and he paused when he heard the rhythmic thrumming of hoofbeats against the hard-packed dirt road leading up from the river. It was a rider moving too fast for a casual visit, and Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach, because good news rarely rode with such urgency as the sun began to dip below the tree line. He reached the gate just as the rider pulled up, a young man named Silas, burdened with a leather satchel and a face pale with exhaustion and fear of his horse foaming at the mouth and trembling from the hard ride. Silas did not dismount but leaned down, gasping for air, his eyes wide and searching Elias's face for some semblance of the stability that seemed to be evaporating from the world. "The British have crossed the river," Silas said, his voice cracking like dry wood. "They are moving toward the armory at Concord, and there is talk of resistance." Elias, real fighting, not just words anymore. Elias gripped the wooden fence post, his knuckles turning white as he processed the words that signaled the end of the peace he had cherished for so long. He looked at Silas and then back at his house, where the lantern light flickered, offering a deceptive sense of safety. "Go home," Silas warns your father," Elias said quietly, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. "Tell him to hide the grain and the livestock, because if war is truly here, armies will need to eat, and they will not ask politely." Silas nodded sharply, turning his horse and galloping away into the deepening twilight, leaving Elias alone with the wind that was picking up speed, tossing the corn stalks like restless spirits. Elias walked to the barn, his sanctuary of tools and honest labor, where the smell of hay and old leather usually calmed him, but tonight it smelled like dry tinder waiting for a spark. He moved to the back corner, shifting a stack of hay bales to reveal a hidden compartment in the floorboards where he kept the things he hoped never to use again: a heavy musket wrapped in oilcloth, a powder horn, and a pouch of lead shot. He unwrapped the weapon, feeling the weight of it in his hands, the cold steel a stark contrast to the warmth of the living wood he was used to shaping. This was a tool of destruction, not creation, and the realization that he would have to use it again made him feel older than his years. He cleaned the mechanism with practiced movements, his fingers remembering the drill from a war fought years ago against the French and Indians, a war that had supposedly secured their safety but had only paved the way for this new conflict. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, heavy and cold, drumming against the roof of the barn like the cadence of a marching army. Elias stepped out into the night, protecting the lock of his musket from the dampness, and looked toward the town, where he could see other lights flickering on as the news spread from house to house like a contagion. He knew that by morning the men of Oakhaven would gather at the meeting house and there would be shouting and speeches about liberty and tyranny, but Elias knew the truth of war, that it was not about words but about mud and blood and the silence that followed the screaming. He walked to the house, entering through the back door, and found Sarah standing by the hearth stirring a pot of stew, her face illuminated by the firelight, looking calm and beautiful in a way that made his heart ache. She turned to him, seeing the musket in his hand and the look in his eyes, and the spoon stopped moving, her smile fading into a line of resignation, because she was a frontier woman and she knew the look of a man who was preparing to defend his home. "Is it time?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, and Elias nodded, placing the musket above the mantel where it had not rested for a decade. "Silas brought news. The British are marching and the storm we feared is finally upon us," Elias said, moving to embrace her, holding her tightly as if he could shield her from the coming days with his own body. They stood there for a long moment, the fire crackling beside them the only sound in the room, while outside the wind rose to a shriek, rattling the shutters and bending the trees. The storm had broken not just the weather but the era of peace, and as the rain lashed against the walls, Elias knew that tomorrow the sun would rise on a different world, a world where neighbors would become enemies and the fields he had tended would become battlegrounds. He pulled away gently and sat at the table, his hands resting on the rough wood, thinking of his sons who were grown and living in the city, and he wondered if they were safe or if they had already been swept up in the fervor of revolution. The dinner was eaten in silence, the food tasting like ash in his mouth, but he ate because he knew he would need his strength for whatever was coming. Later that night, Elias lay awake listening to the storm, staring at the shadowed beams of the ceiling, his mind racing through strategies and supply lines, wondering if the militia was ready, if they had enough powder, if they had the will to stand against the most powerful army in the world. He thought of the letter he had received months ago from a cousin in Boston, speaking of tea dumped in the harbor and soldiers quartered in private homes, and he had dismissed it then as city madness, but now the madness was at his doorstep. The darkness of the room felt heavy, pressing down on him, and he finally rose, unable to sleep, moving to the window to watch the rain slashing through the darkness. A flash of lightning illuminated the valley for a brief second, revealing the familiar landscape in a ghostly stark relief, and in that flash Elias saw the world not as it was but as it would be, scarred and changed. He turned from the window and dressed quietly, putting on his heavy boots and his coat, knowing that he could not wait for morning because leadership was a burden that did not sleep. He lit a lantern and wrote a note for Sarah, leaving it on the table, telling her he was going to the town center to meet with the elders and that she should stay close to the house. Stepping out into the rain, the cold water shocked him, fully awake, washing away the remnants of hesitation. He saddled his horse, a mare named Bess, who nickered softly at the intrusion, and rode out into the storm, the mud splattering against his legs, the wind tearing at his coat. The ride to Oakhaven was treacherous, the road slick and visibility near zero, but Elias knew every twist and turn, every dip and rise. When he arrived at the meeting house, he saw that he was not the first, because several horses were already tethered outside, standing miserable in the downpour. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the smell of wet wool, and the voices were loud and angry, overlapping in a chaotic symphony of fear and bravado. Men he had known all his life were arguing, faces flushed, pointing fingers, slamming fists onto tables. There was intense debate between those who wanted to send a delegation to negotiate and those who wanted to muster the militia immediately. Elias stepped into the room, and his presence commanded a momentary silence, for he was respected not for his words but for his deeds and his steady hand. He shook the rain from his coat and walked to the front of the room, looking at the faces of his neighbors, seeing the fear behind the anger. "We do not have the luxury of negotiation," he said, his voice cutting through the remaining murmurs, clear and authoritative. "The British are not coming to talk, they are coming to take, and if we are not ready to stand, then we have already lost." He laid out a plan not of glory but of survival, assigning men to watch the roads, women to prepare bandages and food, and boys to run messages across the hills. The meeting lasted for hours until the candles burned low and the storm outside began to lose its fury, replaced by a steady cold drizzle. When Elias finally emerged, the first gray light of dawn was bleeding into the sky, a pale, sickly color that offered no warmth. The valley lay before him, shrouded in mist, quiet now, but it was the quiet of a held breath. He mounted his horse and turned back toward his farm, his mind clear, his resolve hardened like steel tempered in fire. The gathering storm had arrived, and Elias Thorne was ready to meet it, knowing that the price of liberty would be high, paid in the currency of blood and sacrifice. But as he looked at the horizon where the sun struggled to break through the clouds, he knew there was no turning back, only the long, hard road ahead into the unknown. The morning sun crested the peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains, casting long shadows across the valley that seemed to stretch like fingers reaching for the farmhouse where Elias Thorne sat, weary from the night's counsel but unable to rest. The ride back from Oakhaven had been solitary and cold, giving him ample time to chew on the bitter reality that the time for talking was over and the time for action had arrived with the force of a hammer striking an anvil. He watched Sarah moving through the kitchen with a stiffness in her back that betrayed her anxiety, and though she said nothing, he knew she could feel the weight of his gaze and the unspoken words that hung between them like heavy smoke. Elias rose from the table, leaving his untouched breakfast, and walked out to the porch where the wooden boards creaked under his boots, a familiar sound that usually brought him comfort but today sounded like the groaning of a dying world. He looked out over his fields, the rows of green shoots that promised a harvest he might never see, and felt a sudden fierce protectiveness surge through his veins, not just for the land but for the memory of the life they had built here. He spent the morning working with a frantic energy that surprised even him, boarding up the lower windows of the barn and hiding the farm tools that could be turned into weapons if they fell into the wrong hands. Silas, his son, was out in the pasture rounding up the cattle to drive them into the deeper woods where they would be harder for foraging soldiers to find, and Elias watched the boy work with a mixture of pride and terror, realizing that Silas was no longer a child but a young man who would soon be asked to carry a man's burden. By midday the sky had cleared, turning a brilliant deceptive blue, but the air remained cool, and the wind carried the faint scent of wood smoke from distant neighbors who were likely burning documents or clearing fields of cover. Elias found Sarah in the cellar wrapping jars of preserves in straw and packing them into wooden crates, her hands moving with a practiced rhythm even as tears streamed silently down her face. He went to her and took her hands, stopping their motion, and she collapsed against him, her body shaking with sobs that she had been holding back for hours. He held her tightly in the dim light of the cellar, surrounded by the smell of earth and apples, and promised her that they would survive this, that the storm would pass and the roots they had put down were too deep to be torn up by the winds of war. They spent the afternoon burying the family silver and a small box of gold coins beneath the old oak tree near the creek, marking the spot with a heavy stone that looked natural to any passerby but would be a beacon to them. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of violet and blood red, the exhaustion finally caught up with Elias, and he sat heavily on the front steps watching the fireflies begin their dance in the tall grass. It was then that Silas approached him, holding his hat in his hands, his face smudged with dirt and sweat, looking every bit the soldier he yearned to be. "Father, I want to go with you," Silas said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "I cannot stay behind while you fight for our freedom." Elias looked at his son, seeing the reflection of his own younger self, the same jawline, the same stubborn set of the shoulders, and his heart broke a little. "You cannot come, Silas," Elias said gently but firmly, "because someone must stay and protect your mother and the farm, for if we win the war but lose our home, then we have won nothing." Silas opened his mouth to argue, but the look on Elias's face silenced him, a look of command and plea entwined. "You are the guardian of this land now," Elias continued, placing a hand on his son's shoulder, "and that is a harder duty than marching into battle, because you must wait and you must endure." The evening meal was a quiet affair, the silence punctuated only by the clinking of silverware and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, measuring out the remaining moments of their peace. After dinner, Sarah cleared the table, and Elias sat by the hearth cleaning his musket again, finding comfort in the mechanical routine. The fire crackled, spitting sparks onto the stone hearth, and Elias stared into the flames, seeing visions of the past and the uncertain future swirling together. Midnight approached and the house settled into a deep stillness, but sleep was a stranger to them all. Elias stood and walked to the window, looking out at the moonlit yard where the shadows seemed to have taken on a life of their own. He felt a hand on his arm and turned to see Sarah standing there, her hair loose around her shoulders, holding a small leather-bound Bible that had belonged to her father. "Make me a promise, Elias," she said, her voice clear and strong in the quiet room. "Promise me that no matter what happens out there in the madness of war, you will not lose yourself." Elias took the book from her hands, feeling the worn leather, and looked into her eyes, seeing the steel that lay beneath her gentleness. "I promise," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I will come back to you, Sarah, and I will come back as the man you married, not a ghost hollowed out by killing." She reached up and touched his cheek, her fingers cool against his skin, and he leaned into her touch, memorizing the feel of it. "There is one more thing," she said, pulling a small locket from around her neck and placing it in his hand. "Inside is a lock of my hair and a lock of Silas's. Keep it close to your heart and remember what you are fighting for." Elias closed his fingers around the cold metal of the locket, nodding slowly, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. The clock in the hall struck 12 chimes, resonating through the house like a tolling bell and marking the arrival of the day he would leave. This was the midnight promise, a vow made in the heart of darkness to hold onto the light of home. They stood there for a long time, holding onto each other as if by sheer will they could stop the rotation of the earth and freeze time in this moment of unity. But time marched on, indifferent to their pleas, and soon the first birds began to sing, heralding the approach of dawn. Elias moved away from the window and began to gather his gear, the musket, the powder horn, the blanket roll, and the small sack of food Sarah had prepared. He moved efficiently, checking each strap and buckle, keeping his mind focused on the tasks at hand to keep the emotions at bay. When he was ready, he turned to face his family. Silas stood by the door, straight and tall, trying to be the man his father needed him to be. Elias walked to him and embraced him, feeling the strength in the boy's frame. "Watch over her, Silas," Elias whispered, and Silas nodded, unable to trust his voice. Then Elias turned to Sarah, who stood by the hearth, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes dry now and filled with a fierce pride. He kissed her one last time, a kiss that tasted of salt and sorrow and promise. "I will return," he said again, sealing the vow. He turned and walked out the door, not looking back, because he knew that if he looked back he might never be able to leave. The night air was cool and crisp, biting at his cheeks as he walked to the barn to saddle Bess. The horse sensed his tension shifting uneasily in her stall, but calmed under his touch. He led her out into the yard and mounted the leather of the saddle creaking. He took one last look at the house, the dark silhouette against the starry sky, the glow of the embers fading in the window, and engraved the image into his mind. Then he turned Bess's head toward the road and nudged her into a trot, the hoofbeats sounding loud in the quiet night. He rode down the lane, past the fields he had tilled, past the stream where he had fished, past the boundaries of the life he had known. The road ahead was dark, winding through the forest like a black ribbon, leading him toward the gathering army and the uncertainty of war. As he rode, he touched the pocket of his coat where the locket lay against his chest and whispered the promise again into the wind. "I will return." The words were a talisman, a shield against the fear that gnawed at his gut. He rode through the remaining hours of darkness, his mind clearing, his focus narrowing to the road ahead. By the time the sun began to paint the eastern sky with the pale pinks and oranges of a new day, Elias was miles away from Oakhaven, deep in the forest where the trees grew thick and ancient. He heard the sound of other riders ahead, the murmur of voices and the clatter of equipment. He slowed Bess to a walk and approached cautiously, his hand drifting to the lock of his musket. A sentry stepped out from the trees, a young man with a grim face raising a hand to halt him. "Who goes there?" the sentry calls out, his voice challenging. "Elias Thorne of Oakhaven," Elias replied, his voice steady. "I come to join the militia." The sentry lowered his weapon and nodded, pointing down the road. "They are gathering at the crossroads a mile ahead," the sentry said. "Godspeed to you, Thorne." Elias nodded and spurred Bess forward, his heart beating a little faster. He was no longer just a farmer defending his land. He was now a soldier in an army of farmers and shopkeepers and blacksmiths united by a common cause. He reached the crossroads as the sun fully broke the horizon, illuminating a sea of men and horses, a chaotic assembly of determination. He saw faces he recognized, men from neighboring towns and strangers from further afield, all drawn together by the drumbeat of liberty. Elias dismounted and tied Bess to a sapling, moving into the crowd looking for the commander. The air was filled with the smell of brewing coffee and damp wool and the sound of men checking their weapons. He found the commander, a grizzled veteran named Captain Hayes, standing by a map spread out on a stump. Hayes looked up as Elias approached, his eyes sharp and assessing. "Thorne," Hayes said, nodding in recognition, "I heard you were coming. We need every good shot we can get." Elias shook the captain's hand, feeling the calluses of a working man. I am here to do my part, Elias said simply. Hayes pointed to a spot on the map, a ridge overlooking the main road to the city. We have reports that a British supply column will pass this way within 2 days. Hayes said we plan to ambush them and cut off their resources before they can reach the main garrison. Elias studied the map, his mind shifting into tactical mode, analyzing the terrain, the choke points, the escape routes. It is a good spot, Elias said, pointing to a ravine, but we will need to secure the high ground here or they will flank us. Hayes smiled, a grim stretching of lips. Exactly what I was thinking. Hayes said you will lead the second squad on the ridge, Thorne. Elias felt the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders, a familiar burden. I will ready the men, Elias said, turning away to find his assigned squad. He spent the rest of the day drilling the men, a ragtag group of farmers who held their muskets like hoes. He taught them how to load and fire in formation, how to use the terrain to their cover, and how to move silently through the underbrush. He was patient but demanding, knowing that their lives depended on their discipline. As evening fell again, Elias sat by a small fire, cleaning his musket once more, the locket pressing against his chest. He looked up at the stars, the same stars that were shining over Oakhaven, and felt a connection to Sarah and Silas bridging the miles between them. He whispered the midnight promise again, letting it anchor him. I will return. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks into the night, and Elias lay back on his blanket, closing his eyes, snatching a few hours of sleep before the war truly began. The mist lay heavy on the valley floor like a damp gray shroud that refused to lift even as the sun climbed higher into the pale sky, masking the movements of the militia as they marched south away from the safety of the known and into the teeth of the conflict. Elias Thorne walked at the head of his squad, his boots sinking into the soft mud of the trail, a rhythmic squelching sound that mixed with the jingle of canteens and the labored breathing of men who were not yet hardened soldiers. The beauty of the Shenandoah Valley was legendary, a tapestry of rolling hills and deep green forests that had inspired poets and painters, but to Elias on this morning it felt like a trap waiting for spring. He kept his eyes scanning the tree line, his senses heightened by the adrenaline that had been coursing through him since they left the crossroads. Beside him walked young Thomas, a boy of no more than 17 whose hands gripped his musket so tightly that his knuckles were white, a stark reminder of Silas back home. Elias reached out and touched the boy's shoulder, a silent gesture of reassurance that seemed to startle Thomas before he offered a nervous smile. Keep your eyes up, Thomas, Elias said quietly, his voice barely rising above the whisper of the wind. Watch the shadows, not your feet, for the ground will not kill you, but what hides in the trees might. The column moved slowly, a long snake of brown and gray coats winding through the wilderness, led by Captain Hayes, who rode ahead with a grim determination that infected them all. They had been marching for 3 days now, sleeping on the cold ground and eating hardtack that tasted of dust and despair, but the morale held together by the glue of shared purpose. Around midday the terrain began to change, the dense forest giving way to rocky outcrops and steep ravines that forced them to break their formation and move single file. It was here that the shadow of war first touched them, not with a bang but with a smell. It was a scent that Elias knew from his days fighting on the frontier, a sickly sweet odor of charred wood and something else, something darker that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The column halted and word was passed down the line to hold position and check weapons. Elias moved forward to join Captain Hayes, who was peering through a brass spyglass at a plume of smoke rising from a homestead in the distance. It is the Miller place, Hayes said, his voice flat with suppressed rage. They were good people who wanted no part in this war. Elias took the glass and looked, seeing the blackened skeleton of a barn and the house reduced to a pile of smoldering rubble. There was no movement, no sign of life, only the crows circling overhead like harbingers of doom. We need to check for survivors, Elias said, lowering the glass, though in his heart he knew what they would find. Hayes nodded and signaled for Elias to take his squad and investigate while the rest of the company provided cover. They moved down the slope, moving low and fast, using the brush to conceal their hearts pounding in their chests. As they approached the ruins, the heat was still radiating from the stones and the silence was deafening, broken only by the crackle of dying embers. Elias signaled for his men to spread out and they moved through the wreckage with a reverence reserved for graveyards. He found a child's doll lying in the mud, its porcelain face cracked and blackened by soot, and he felt a cold fury settle in his gut, a burning coal of hatred for the men who would visit such destruction on the innocent. There were no bodies, which meant the Millers had either fled or been taken, and the uncertainty was a torture in itself. Thomas called out from near the well, his voice shaking, and Elias went to him, seeing the boy staring at a set of hoofprints deep in the mud. "British cavalry," Elias said, studying the tracks fresh. "Maybe only a few hours old. They are moving north back toward the main road." The reality of their situation crashed down on the squad, for they were not chasing a phantom enemy but a real and brutal force that was close enough to touch. They regrouped and returned to the main column, reporting their findings to Hayes, who listened with a jaw set like granite. "If they are moving north, they will cross the river at Harper's Ford," Hayes said, looking at the map. "If we hurry, we can cut them off before they rejoin their regiment." The order was given to double time, and the men moved with a new urgency, their fatigue forgotten, replaced by a thirst for justice. The march became a grueling race against the sun, the path becoming steeper and more treacherous as they navigated the backwoods trails known only to locals. Elias pushed his men hard, his voice a constant presence, urging them on when they stumbled, picking them up when they fell. Shadows began to lengthen, stretching across the valley like the bars of a prison cell as the afternoon wore on. They reached the ridge overlooking the ford just as the sun began to dip below the mountains, casting the river in a blood-red light. Below them they saw the enemy patrol of perhaps 20 redcoats watering their horses and resting by the riverbank, unaware that death was watching from the trees. They were relaxed, laughing and smoking pipes, their red uniforms bright against the natural tones of the forest, a display of arrogance that made Elias's finger itch on the trigger. Hayes signaled for the men to form a firing line along the ridge hidden by the foliage, and Elias took his place next to Thomas, whispering instructions. "Do not fire until I give the word. Aim for the officers first, and remember to breathe." The tension in the air was thick and electric, the silence of the woods amplifying the sound of the river and the beating of their own hearts. Elias sighted down the barrel of his musket, fixing his aim on a lieutenant who was casually wiping his brow with a handkerchief. He thought of the Miller farm, of the broken doll of Sarah and Silas back home, and he steadied his breathing, exhaling slowly as he squeezed the trigger. "Fire!" Captain Hayes roared, and the command was lost in the thunderous volley of 50 muskets firing as one. The ridge erupted in smoke and flame, and down by the river chaos ensued. Men fell where they stood, cut down by the invisible scythe of lead, while horses reared and screamed, throwing their riders into the water. Elias reloaded with practiced speed, his hands moving in a blur, pouring powder, ramming the ball, priming the pan, his world narrowing to the mechanics of the kill. He fired again and again, the smoke stinging his eyes, the taste of black powder in his mouth. The British were disciplined, returning fire, but they were caught in the open, exposed and panicked. The skirmish was over in minutes, leaving the riverbank littered with bodies and the water running red. "Cease fire!" Hayes called out, and the shooting stopped, replaced by the groans of the wounded and the ringing in their ears. Elias stood up, surveying the carnage, feeling no joy, only a grim satisfaction that a debt had been paid. "We moved down," Hayes ordered, "to secure the horses and check for intelligence." They descended the ridge, moving carefully among the fallen. Elias walked past the body of the lieutenant he had shot, seeing the young face now slack in death, and he felt a moment of pity, not for the uniform but for the life wasted. Thomas was standing over a dead soldier, his face pale, his musket hanging limp in his hand. "I got him," Elias, Thomas whispered. "I think I got him." "You did what you had to do," Thomas, Elias said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder, "and it will never be easy, but it is necessary." They gathered the supplies from the British saddlebags, ammunition, food, and a map that showed the movements of the main army, a prize of immense value. As twilight deepened into night, they moved away from the river, seeking a defensible campsite deeper in the woods, away from the smell of death. They made no fires that night, eating cold rations in the dark, the euphoria of victory fading into a somber reflection. Elias sat with his back against a tree, listening to the night sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, the breathing of sleeping men. He took out the locket Sarah had given him, opening it in the darkness, running his thumb over the glass. The shadows across the valley were not just from the mountains or the trees, they were the shadows of what they had become. They were killers, now men who had looked into the abyss and survived, but a part of their innocence had been left back on that riverbank. Elias knew that this was only the beginning, that there would be more battles, more death, more fire, and he prayed for the strength to endure it all without losing his soul. He looked over at Thomas, who was sleeping fitfully, twitching in his dreams, and Elias silently vowed to protect the boy as best he could, to be the father figure he needed in this hell. The wind shifted, bringing a chill that seeped into his bones, a precursor to the winter that was coming, both in the season and in the war. Elias closed the locket and put it back in his pocket, his hand resting on the smooth metal. He thought of the letter he would write to Sarah if he ever got the chance, telling her not of the killing but of the courage of the men, of the beauty of the land, and of his love that burned brighter than any war fire. The night dragged on, a long vigil kept by the moon and the memories of peace. In the distance a wolf howled, a lonely, mournful sound that echoed the emptiness in Elias's heart. He closed his eyes, forcing his body to rest, knowing that tomorrow the sun would rise again and the shadows would retreat, but they would never truly be gone. They were part of him now, woven into the fabric of his being. The war had truly begun, not in the speeches of politicians, but here in the mud and the blood of the valley. And as Elias Thorne drifted into a light sleep, he dreamed of a field of corn swaying in the wind, golden and whole, untouched by the shadow of the hawk or the soldier, a dream of home that felt 1,000,000 miles away. The first snow did not come gently. It arrived with the ferocity of a judgment, burying the world in white and bringing with it a silence so profound it felt like the earth itself had stopped breathing. Elias Thorne sat huddled near a pitiful fire that hissed and popped against the damp wood, the smoke stinging his eyes, which were rimmed with red from sleeplessness, and the biting wind that found its way through every seam of his tattered coat. It was the winter of silence, a season where the roar of cannons and the sharp crack of muskets were replaced by the muffled quiet of falling snow and the chattering of teeth. The regiment had encamped in a hollow between two ridges, seeking shelter from the gales, but the cold was an enemy that knew no borders, seeping into the marrow of their bones and turning their blood to sludge. Elias looked around the circle of shivering men in his squad, who had once been vibrant farmers and tradesmen, now reduced to hollow-cheeked specters wrapped in blankets that were little more than rags. Young Thomas lay curled up on a bed of pine boughs, his breathing shallow and rattling in his chest, a sound that tore at Elias's heart, because he had promised to keep the boy safe, and now he was fighting a foe he could not shoot. The camp was a landscape of misery, with makeshift huts constructed of logs and mud offering scant protection against the freezing nights, and the food supplies had dwindled to a handful of parched corn and salted beef that was as hard as stone. Hunger was a constant companion, a gnawing beast in their bellies that made them dream of roast chicken and warm bread, only to wake to the gray light of another freezing dawn. Elias reached out and adjusted the blanket over Thomas, tucking it tighter around the boy's shoulders, feeling the heat radiating from his feverish skin, a stark contrast to the icy air. He took a metal cup and melted some snow over the fire, mixing in a pinch of precious dried herbs he had scavenged from the forest floor, hoping to break the fever that had gripped the boy for 3 days. "Drink this, Thomas," Elias whispered, lifting the boy's head gently, his voice rough from disuse, for in this winter men spoke little, saving their energy for the act of shivering. Thomas opened his eyes, glazed and unseeing for a moment before recognition flickered, and he sipped the bitter liquid, grimacing but swallowing it down. "I want to go home." Elias Thomas murmured, his voice barely a wisp of sound. "I can hear my mother calling me." "You will go home, son," Elias said, lying with the ease of a man who knew that hope was the only medicine left. "We will all go home when the spring comes and the sun returns to the world." But looking at the gray sky heavy with more unfallen snow, Elias wondered if spring would ever come, or if they were destined to become frozen statues in this forgotten hollow. The days blurred into a monotonous cycle of survival, gathering wood for the fires, foraging for anything edible, and burying the dead who succumbed to the cold or the sickness. The ground was frozen hard like iron, making the digging of graves a labor of Herculean effort, so they piled stones over the bodies, leaving them to the silence of the winter. Elias took to walking the perimeter at night, not because it was his watch, but because the movement kept his blood flowing and his mind from collapsing into the dark pit of despair. He walked through the silent woods, the snow crunching loudly under his boots, the trees standing like black skeletons against the white backdrop, their branches heavy with ice. In these solitary moments he spoke to Sarah in his head, telling her about the beauty of the frost on the spiderwebs and the way the moonlight turned the valley into a sea of silver, sparing her the details of the frostbite and the dysentery and the fear that kept men awake. He imagined her sitting by the hearth in Oakhaven, the firelight dancing on her face and the thought of a warm coal in his chest that kept him moving one foot in front of the other. One particularly brutal night when the temperature dropped so low that the trees cracked like rifle shots, Elias found himself standing at the edge of the camp, looking out into the darkness, feeling the lure of the sleep that ends in death. It would be so easy to just sit down to close his eyes and let the cold take him to drift away into a numbness where there was no more war and no more pain. But then he touched the locket beneath his layers of clothing, feeling the hard metal against his skin, and the promise he had made surged back with a vengeance. "I will return." He shook his head violently, clearing the lethargy, and turned back toward the camp, his resolve hardening like the ice in the creek. He returned to his fire to find Thomas sitting up, his eyes clear for the first time in days, the fever having broken, leaving him weak but alive. Elias felt a wave of relief so potent it almost brought him to his knees, and he sat down beside the boy, handing him a piece of hardtack he had been saving. "You looked death in the eye and blinked." Thomas, Elias said with a small smile cracking his chapped lips. "I saw a light," Thomas said, quietly eating the dry bread with trembling hands. "I thought it was the end, but then I heard your voice calling me back." Elias nodded, stoking the fire, adding a precious log to the flames, pushing back the shadows. "We are not done yet," he said, staring into the fire. "We have miles to go before we sleep." The next morning brought a small miracle. A hunting party returned with a stag, a magnificent creature that had been caught in a drift, and for the first time in weeks there was fresh meat. The smell of roasting venison drifted through the camp, waking men from their stupor, drawing them out of their huts like bears from hibernation. They feasted that day not with gluttony but with a reverence for the life that had been given to sustain them, and as the grease ran down their chins and the warmth of the meat filled their bellies, the silence of the winter was broken by the sound of laughter. It was a ragged, rusty sound, but it was the sound of life, and it signaled a turning point. They had hit the bottom of the abyss and had not broken. Elias watched his men, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, the way their spines straightened a little, the way the light returned to their eyes. They began to organize properly, building better shelters, reinforcing the walls with woven branches and mud, creating a system of drainage to keep the floors dry. Elias led the efforts, his hands never idle, teaching them how to weave pine needles into insulation, how to trap rabbits in the brush, and how to keep their powder dry even in the damp. He became more than a sergeant, he became a father, a priest, a pillar of stone in a shifting landscape. The weeks dragged on and the snow piled higher, but the fear had receded, replaced by a grim determination. They were the survivors, the ones who refused to fade into the white oblivion. One evening, as Elias sat whittling a piece of ash wood into a new spoon, a stranger rode into camp, a courier from the Continental Congress, his horse gaunt and stumbling. The man brought news of victories in the north, of French alliances being whispered in the courts of Europe, of a general named Washington who was holding the army together by sheer force of will. The news spread through the camp like wildfire, igniting a spark of hope that had been buried under the snow. They were not alone. They were part of a grand design revolution that was shaking the foundations of the world. Elias listened to the courier reading a proclamation by the fire, the words speaking of liberty and the rights of man, and he felt a stirring in his soul that had nothing to do with the cold. This suffering, this winter of silence, was the price they were paying for that future, and for the first time Elias felt that the price might be worth it. He looked at Thomas, who was listening with rapt attention, his face illuminated by the fire, and saw the boy becoming a man forged in the crucible of hardship. As February gave way to March, the grip of winter began to loosen, the sun lingering a little longer each day, the snow turning to slush that flooded the creeks. The silence began to break, not with the sounds of war but with the sounds of the earth waking up, the dripping of melting ice, the call of returning birds, the cracking of the river. Elias stood on the ridge overlooking the camp, watching the mist rise from the valley, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face, a sensation that felt like a benediction. He knew that the fighting would resume soon, that the mud would dry and the armies would march again, but he also knew that they were ready. They had survived the winter of silence, and in doing so they had discovered a strength they did not know they possessed. They had learned that the cold could not kill the fire in their hearts if they tended it together. Elias walked back down to the camp, his step lighter, his spirit renewed. He found Thomas polishing his musket, the metal gleaming in the sunlight. "We will be moving soon," Elias said, and Thomas nodded, looking up with a steady gaze. "I am ready," Elias Thomas said, and this time there was no fear in his voice, only a calm acceptance. Elias smiled, clapping the young man on the shoulder. "Then let us prepare," he said, "for the storm is returning, but this time we will be the ones bringing the thunder." The camp bustled with activity, men repairing boots, cleaning weapons, packing gear. The lethargy of the winter shed like an old skin. Elias wrote a letter to Sarah that night using a piece of charcoal on a scrap of birch bark, telling her that they had survived, that the winter was over, and that he was coming closer to keeping his promise. He did not know when he would be able to send it, but writing the words was an act of faith. He folded the bark and placed it in his pocket next to the locket, two tangible pieces of the world he was fighting for. That night he slept soundly, the silence of the winter replaced by the comforting sounds of a camp preparing for war, the snore of men, the stamps of horses, the murmur of sentries. The silence was gone, and the echoes of the frontier were calling him back to the fight, back to the blood and the liberty and the long road home. The thaw had finally come, turning the frozen earth of the valley into a quagmire of sucking mud that grasped at the boots of the marching men as if the land itself were trying to hold them back from the bloodshed to come. Elias Thorne walked with a new heaviness in his stride, not from the physical burden of his pack, but from a growing unease that had settled in his gut like a stone swallowed whole. The regiment had moved out of the wilderness and into the relative comfort of a garrison town named Fairfield, a bustling hub of activity where the war was fought with quills and ledgers as much as with muskets and cannons. The transition from the starving winter to the abundance of the town should have been a relief, a time to fatten their bodies and mend their spirits, but to Elias the town felt like a masquerade where smiles hid daggers and loyalty was a currency that fluctuated with the market. They were quartered in a requisitioned warehouse near the docks where the smell of river water and tar hung thick in the air, masking the underlying scent of rot that seemed to permeate the cobblestone streets. Elias spent his days drilling his men in the courtyard, trying to instill the discipline of the regular army into their militia hearts, but his nights were spent watching and listening for the whispers that drifted through the taverns and the alleyways. There was talk of a spy in their midst, a phantom who sold the lives of patriots for gold, and the rumors had turned the garrison into a place of suspicion where men looked at their neighbors with narrowed eyes, wondering if the hand that offered a drink today would hold a knife tomorrow. The trouble had started a week ago when a supply convoy carrying powder and lead to the front lines had been ambushed with surgical precision, the enemy knowing exactly where and when to strike. 10 good men had died in that ambush, men Elias had shared bread with during the winter, and their deaths weighed on him because it was not bad luck but betrayal that had killed them. Captain Hayes had called a meeting of the senior officers and sergeants, his face drawn and the lines around his mouth etched deep with worry. "We have a leak," Hayes had said, his voice low and dangerous. "Someone in this camp is feeding intelligence to the British, and I want him found before he bleeds us dry." Elias had taken the order to heart, moving through the town like a shadow, his senses attuned to the dissonance in the rhythm of daily life. He found himself drawn to the officers' mess, a grand house on the hill where the wine flowed freely and the laughter was too loud and too brittle. It was there that he first noticed Lieutenant Sterling, a man of polished manners and impeccable uniform whose boots were always shined and whose hands looked like they had never held a plow or a shovel. Sterling was a supply officer, a man with access to the schedules and the manifests, and he moved through the room with the easy grace of a predator surrounded by prey. Elias watched him from the corner, nursing a mug of ale that he did not drink, observing the way Sterling's eyes darted around the room even as he smiled and charmed the local ladies. There was a hunger in Sterling, not for food or for victory, but for something else, something that smelled of greed and ambition. One rainy Tuesday evening, when the fog rolled off the river and wrapped the town in a blanket of gray, Elias saw Sterling leave the mess hall alone, pulling his cloak tight against the damp. Elias followed him, keeping a safe distance, his footsteps silent on the wet stones thanks to the moccasins he had swapped for his heavy boots. Sterling moved with purpose, avoiding the main streets, weaving through the labyrinth of alleys that led down to the waterfront where the warehouses loomed like sleeping giants. The town was asleep, The shutters closed against the night, but the docks were alive with the creaking of ships and the lapping of water against the pilings. Elias watched as Sterling stopped near an old tannery, a place that smelled of harsh chemicals and decay, and waited in the shadows of a stack of crates. A moment later, a figure emerged from the darkness. A man hooded and cloaked, his face obscured but bearing that of a soldier. They spoke in hushed tones, their words lost to the wind, but Elias saw the exchange of a small packet of papers passing from Sterling's hand to the stranger's and a heavy purse of coins moving in the opposite direction. The transaction was quick, efficient, and damning. Elias felt a surge of rage so hot it almost blinded him, a desire to rush forward and strike the traitor down where he stood, but he forced himself to remain still, knowing that a dead spy could not reveal his network. He waited until the stranger had slipped away into the night and Sterling had turned back toward the town before he moved, following the lieutenant back to his quarters. Elias did not sleep that night, his mind racing with the implications of what he had seen, for Sterling was not just a rogue officer but a man with connections to the general staff, a man whose betrayal could cost them the war. The next morning the sun rose behind a veil of clouds, casting a pale sickly light over the garrison as Elias sought out Captain Hayes, finding him in the command tent shaving with a straight razor, his hands steady despite the tension in the camp. Elias recounted what he had seen, describing the meeting, the packet, and the gold, leaving nothing out. Hayes listened in silence, wiping the soap from his face with a towel, his eyes hardening with every word. "Sterling is a well-connected man," Hayes said quietly, throwing the towel onto the table. "His father is a judge in Boston and his influence reaches far. If we accuse him, we must be certain, Elias, for if we are wrong it will be our heads in the noose." "I am certain," Elias replied with his voice like granite. "I saw the gold, Hayes, and I saw the guilt in his walk." Hayes nodded, slowly pacing the small confines of the tent, his mind working through the strategy not of battle but of politics. "We need the papers," Hayes said finally. "We need to know what he gave them, and we need proof that cannot be denied. Tonight there is a gala at the governor's mansion, and Sterling will be there preening like a peacock, which means his quarters will be empty." Elias understood the order without it being spoken explicitly. He spent the day preparing, checking his tools, and calming his nerves, for breaking into an officer's quarters was a crime punishable by whipping or worse, but the stakes were too high for hesitation. As dusk fell and the carriages began to clatter toward the mansion carrying the elite of the town in their silks and velvets, Elias slipped into the shadows of the barracks. Sterling had a private room at the end of the officer's block, a privilege of his rank and station. The hallway was empty, the other officers either at the gala or on duty, and Elias moved quickly, picking the lock with a piece of bent wire, a trick he had learned from a trapper years ago. The door clicked open and he slipped inside, closing it softly behind him. The room smelled of lavender water and expensive tobacco, a stark contrast to the smell of sweat and unwashed wool that permeated the enlisted men's quarters. Elias moved to the desk, a fine piece of mahogany cluttered with maps and ledgers, and began to search, his hands moving lightly over the papers. He found nothing incriminating in the drawers, only requests for supplies and letters from home that spoke of mundane matters. He checked under the mattress, behind the painting on the wall, and inside the hollow of the fireplace, but found nothing. Panic began to prick at the back of his neck, the fear that he was wrong or that Sterling was too clever to leave a trail. He stood in the center of the room, scanning it with desperate eyes, and then he noticed the floorboards beneath the heavy wardrobe. One of them was slightly lighter than the others, the dust disturbed as if it had been moved recently. Elias knelt and pried at the board with his knife, and it came loose, revealing a small cavity beneath. Inside lay a leather satchel bound with twine. His heart pounding against his ribs, Elias opened the satchel and pulled out a sheaf of papers. He held them up to the moonlight filtering through the window and read the top document. It was a detailed map of the regiment's planned movements for the next month, along with a list of the artillery positions and the locations of the secret supply depots. At the bottom was the signature not of Sterling but of a British colonel, thanking his operational asset for the continued loyalty to the crown. It was proof absolute and undeniable. Elias shoved the papers into his shirt and replaced the board, smoothing the dust back over it to hide his tracks. He was about to leave when he heard footsteps in the hall, heavy and approaching fast. He froze, his hand going to the knife at his belt. The door handle turned and the door opened, revealing not Sterling but a young orderly who stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes going wide with shock. "What are you doing here?" The orderly stammered, dropping the pitcher of water he was carrying, which shattered on the floor with a sound like a gunshot. Elias moved before the boy could scream, covering the distance in 2 strides and clapping a hand over his mouth. "Listen to me," Elias hissed into the boy's ear. "I am not a thief. I am doing the work of the Patriots. Sterling is a traitor, and I have the proof. Do you understand?" The boy's eyes were wide with terror, but he nodded slowly, and Elias loosened his grip slightly. "If you raise the alarm, you will be helping the British kill your brothers," Elias said, his voice intense and compelling. "Go back to the mess and say nothing." The boy nodded again, and Elias released him, pushing him gently into the hall before slipping out himself and disappearing into the night. He ran to Hayes's tent, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his chest burning. He found Hayes waiting by a lantern and slammed the papers down on the table. "It is all there," Elias said, panting. "He has sold us out completely." Hayes read the documents, his face turning purple with rage. Hayes whispered, "The absolute bastard, he was sending us to the slaughter." Hayes grabbed his pistol and strapped on his sword, his demeanor changing from thoughtful commander to a vengeful angel. "Gather your squad," Thorne, Hayes ordered. "We are going to the governor's mansion, and we are going to drag that traitor out by his heels." The march to the mansion was a blur of motion and anger. Elias and his men surrounded the building, their rough uniforms and grim faces a stark contrast to the elegance of the party inside. Hayes marched up the steps, pushing past the protesting doormen and threw open the double doors of the ballroom. The music stopped abruptly, the fiddles screeching to a halt, and the dancers froze in place, staring at the intrusion. Sterling was standing near the fireplace with a glass of wine in his hand, laughing at something a woman had said. He looked up with annoyance flashing across his face, which quickly turned to fear as he saw the look in Hayes's eyes. "Lieutenant Sterling," Captain Hayes boomed, his voice filling the cavernous room, "you are under arrest for treason against the Continental Army and the people of these colonies." A gasp went through the crowd, and Sterling took a step back, his glass slipping from his fingers and shattering on the hearth. "This is preposterous," Sterling sputtered, trying to regain his composure. "I am an officer and a gentleman. How dare you interrupt this gathering?" Hayes threw the packet of letters at Sterling's feet, the papers scattering across the polished floor. "Your gentlemanly honor is written there in your own hand." Hayes said, "You have sold the lives of brave men for British gold." Sterling looked at the papers, and his face went white, the mask of arrogance crumbling to reveal the coward beneath. He looked for a way out, his eyes darting to the windows, but Elias and his men had blocked every exit, musket held at the ready. Sterling drew his sword, a desperate futile gesture, but before he could raise it, Elias was there, knocking the blade aside with the barrel of his musket and striking Sterling across the jaw with the butt of the weapon. Sterling crumbled to the floor, unconscious and bleeding, his fine uniform stained with wine and blood. The room was silent save for the heavy breathing of the soldiers. "Take him away," Hayes ordered, pointing to the slumped figure. Elias and Thomas dragged Sterling out of the room, the guests parting like the Red Sea, their faces a mixture of horror and fascination. They threw him into the brig, a cold, damp cell beneath the barracks where he would await his trial. Later that night, Elias sat on the docks watching the dark water of the river flow out toward the sea. The adrenaline had faded, leaving him feeling hollow and old. He had done his duty, he had caught the spy and saved the regiment, but there was no triumph in it, only a deep sadness. He realized that the war was not just fighting the enemy in the field, but fighting the darkness within their own ranks, the greed and the fear that could turn a brother into a Judas. Thomas came and sat beside him, offering him a piece of bread. "Is it over?" Elias Thomas asked quietly. "For tonight it is over," Elias replied, taking the bread, though he had no appetite. "But tomorrow there will be another battle, another march, and perhaps another traitor, for war is a weed that grows in every garden." He looked at the boy, seeing the trust in his eyes, and felt the weight of the locket against his chest. "We must be vigilant," Thomas, Elias said. "We must be the watchers on the wall, for if we sleep the darkness will take us all." The whispers of treason had been silenced for now, but the echo remained, a reminder that liberty was a fragile thing, constantly under siege, not just by armies but by the weakness of the human heart. Elias stood up, dusting the dirt from his breeches, and looked toward the east where the first hint of dawn was touching the sky. "Come," he said to Thomas, "let us get some sleep, for we march at noon and the road is long." They walked back to the barracks, leaving the river and the secrets of the night behind them, ready to face the day and whatever new storms it might bring, their resolve tested but unbroken, their spirits scarred but standing. The traitor Sterling had been cast into the darkness of a cell, but the shadows he left behind seemed to stretch across the land, merging with the oppressive heat of a summer that had arrived with a vengeance, turning the roads to dust and the air to a shimmering haze that distorted the horizon. Elias Thorne marched with his regiment not as a ragtag band of militia anymore, but as a hardened cog in a growing machine of war, for they had received orders to join the main body of the Continental Army, where General Washington himself was massing the troops for a confrontation that would decide the fate of the colonies. The road was a river of sweat and determination, filled with the tramp of thousands of boots and the creaking of heavy caissons carrying the artillery that would speak with the voice of thunder. But above the noise of the march, above the shouting of sergeants and the whinnying of horses, there was a sound that seemed to beat in time with Elias's own heart, a rhythmic, relentless pounding that never ceased from dawn until dusk and often deep into the night. It was the drums of war, rolling like distant thunder, calling the men forward, driving them on when their legs screamed for rest and their throats were parched with thirst. Elias looked at Thomas, who walked beside him, his face streaked with dust, and saw that the boy had grown leaner, his eyes older, losing the softness of youth with every mile they covered. They were moving toward a vast open plain near the river, a place where the maps said the British were gathering in their thousands, their red coats staining the landscape like drops of blood. The intelligence that Elias had recovered from Sterling's quarters had been vital, giving the generals the time they needed to position their forces, but knowledge was a heavy burden, for it took away the comfort of ignorance. Elias knew exactly what they were walking into. He knew the numbers and the firepower of the enemy, and the weight of that knowledge pressed down on him like the heavy wool of his coat. They arrived at the encampment 3 days later, a sprawling city of white tents that stretched as far as the eye could see, a testament to the will of a people who refused to be ruled. The sight was breathtaking, a display of unity that Elias had never imagined possible, men from every colony speaking with different accents but united by a single cause. Yet amidst the grandeur there was a palpable tension, a vibration in the air like a violin string pulled too tight, ready to snap at the slightest touch. The days were spent in grueling drills, moving in formation, learning to wheel and turn as a single unit, for in the open field discipline was the only shield against the British volley. Elias shouted orders until his voice was hoarse, correcting a stance here, adjusting a grip there, his patience tested by the heat and the exhaustion, but he never wavered, for he knew that every mistake corrected now was a life saved later. At night the fires of the camp looked like a reflection of the starry sky above, thousands of points of light flickering in the dark. Elias sat by his fire, cleaning his musket with a rhythmic motion, his mind traveling back to Oakhaven, to the cool shade of the porch and the smell of Sarah's baking. He wondered if Silas was keeping up with the harvest, if the corn was high, and if the war had touched their quiet valley yet. He took out the locket, pressing it to his lips, the metal warm from his body heating a tangible link to the life he was fighting to preserve. Thomas sat across from him, staring into the flames, his hands twitching slightly, a nervous habit he had developed since the ambush at the river. "Do you hear them?" Elias Thomas asked in his voice barely a whisper. "The drums never stop. Even when I close my eyes, I can hear them beating inside my head." Elias nodded slowly, for he heard them too, a phantom cadence that haunted their dreams. "They are the heartbeat of the army." "Thomas," Elias said quietly, "they remind us that we are alive and that we have a duty to perform. Do not fear the sound, for silence is the sound of the grave." The next morning brought a flurry of activity, couriers galloping through the lines, officers shouting orders, and the sudden frantic striking of tents. The British were on the move, advancing toward a strategic ridge that overlooked the valley, and if they took it they would control the entire region. The drums beat louder now, a frantic, urgent tempo that sent adrenaline surging through the veins of every soldier. The regiment formed up, standing shoulder to shoulder, a wall of blue and brown facing the rising sun. Captain Hayes rode up and down the line with his sword drawn, his horse dancing sideways in excitement. "Today we stand," Hayes shouted, his voice carrying over the noise. "Today we show the world that free men fight harder than hired soldiers hold the line. Men hold it for your wives, for your children, for your homes." A roar went up from the ranks, a release of the fear and the anger that had been building for months. Elias gripped his musket, his knuckles white, feeling the familiar calm descend upon him, the cold focus of the marksman. They marched out of the camp and onto the field, the grass tall and green, soon to be trampled and stained. In the distance, across a meadow shimmering with heat, they saw them. The British army was a magnificent, terrifying sight. A solid wall of red and white bayonets glinting in the sun like a field of steel wheat. They moved with mechanical precision, the drums of the enemy answering their own conversation of death played out in percussion. Elias watched them come, his eyes narrowing, calculating the distance. The wind dropped the ball. He felt Thomas tremble beside him, and he leaned in close, his voice steady and low. "Breathe, Thomas," Elias said. "Just breathe. Look at me. Do not look at the red coats. Look at the trees. Look at the sky. Remember who you are." Thomas looked at him, his eyes wide with panic, but he nodded, taking a ragged breath and steadying his musket. The two armies halted, separated by perhaps 200 yards of open ground, a killing field waiting to be sown. The silence that followed was unnaturally a pause before the storm, where the only sound was the wind in the grass and the distant cawing of crows who knew that a feast was preparing. Then the drums began again, a rolling thunder that signaled the advance. The British line stepped forward, a wave of red moving with inexorable slowness. Hayes roared and the command echoed down the line. Elias raised his musket, the heavy wood settling against his shoulder, the sights aligning with the chest of a tall grenadier in the front rank. He did not hate the man, he did not know him, but he was an obstacle on the road to liberty, and he had to be removed. "Present arms," Hayes shouted. The click of hundreds of hammers being pulled back sounded like the breaking of dry twigs. The British were closer now, close enough to see the faces of the men, close enough to see the sweat on their brows. They stopped and raised their own muskets, a mirror image of death. Fire. The command was simultaneous on both sides. The world exploded in smoke and noise, a deafening roar that shook the earth. Elias fired, feeling the kick of the weapon, and immediately dropped to one knee to reload, his hands moving with the muscle memory born of 1,000 drills. Around him men fell, some screaming, some silent, cut down by the lead hail. The air was thick with sulphurous smoke, blinding and choking, reducing the world to a gray fog where shadows moved and flashed. Elias stood and fired again into the smoke, aiming at the flashes of the enemy muskets. "Hold the line," Hayes was screaming somewhere to the left. "Hold the line, damn you." The drums were pounding madly now, a chaotic rhythm that matched the beating of Elias's heart. He saw Thomas firing, reloading, firing, his face a mask of soot and determination, the fear gone, replaced by the instinct to survive. The British charged, emerging from the smoke with bayonets leveled, a terrifying scream rising from their throats. "Fix bayonets," Elias yelled. The order rippled down the squad. He pulled the long steel blade from his belt and locked it onto the muzzle of his gun, transforming the firearm into a spear. They clashed in the middle of the field, a brutal, intimate struggle of steel and muscle where there was no time to reload, no time to think, only to thrust and parry and kill. Elias fought with a cold fury, using the butt of his musket to smash a soldier who lunged at him, driving the bayonet into another who tried to flank Thomas. The noise was indescribable, the clang of metal, the screams of the dying, the roar of the officers. It was a descent into hell, a place where civilization stripped away, leaving only the primal beast. Elias lost track of time, the battle becoming a blur of images: a red coat, a flashing blade, a falling horse. He fought to protect Thomas, he fought to return to Sarah, he fought because there was no other choice. Suddenly, a cannonball plowed through the ranks to his right, tearing a path of destruction and throwing Elias to the ground with the force of the shockwave. He lay there for a moment, stunned, his ears ringing, staring up at the sky, which was now darkened by smoke. He could hear the drums still beating, a dull thudding in his skull. He pushed himself up, shaking his head to clear the dizziness. He saw the line wavering, the men starting to break under the relentless pressure of the British advance. "We are losing them," Elias thought, panic flaring in his chest. He looked for Hayes and saw the captain down, his horse dead, pinned beneath the animal. Elias grabbed the regimental colors from the hands of a falling ensign, the flag tattered and stained with blood. He raised the flag high, waving it back and forth, a beacon in the smoke. "Rallying to me," he screamed, his voice tearing from his throat. "To rally the colors, men of Oakhaven, stand fast." The sight of the flag rising from the chaos seemed to snap the men out of their panic. They looked at Elias standing tall amidst the carnage, the flag snapping in the wind, and they remembered who they were. They rallied, forming a defensive circle around him, their bayonets facing outward, a porcupine of steel. They fought with renewed desperation, holding the ground, denying the enemy the victory. The British wave broke against their wall, unable to penetrate the resolve of men fighting for their homes. Slowly, the red tide began to recede, leaving the field littered with the fallen. The British trumpets sounded the retreat, and the redcoats fell back, disappearing into the smoke. The firing died down, replaced by the groans of the wounded. Elias lowered the flag, his arms trembling with exhaustion, the adrenaline draining away, leaving him weak. He looked around, searching for his squad. He saw Thomas sitting on the ground holding his arm, blood seeping through his fingers, but he was alive. Elias walked over to him and sank to his knees beside the boy. "We held them," Thomas said, his voice filled with awe. "That we actually held them." "We did," Elias said, wiping the sweat and soot from his eyes. "We held." The drums had stopped finally. The silence that returned was not the silence of peace, but the silence of exhaustion, the silence of the aftermath. Elias looked out over the field, seeing the cost of the day. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows that covered the dead in a merciful darkness. He felt a profound sadness and grief for the lives lost on both sides, but underneath it lay a steely resolve. The drums of war had called them to the fire, and they had walked through it and survived. Elias reached into his shirt and touched the locket, finding it still there, safe against his heart. He had kept his promise for another day. He looked at the horizon where the smoke was drifting away and knew that this was not the end. The war would go on, the drums would beat again, and he would answer. But for tonight, as the stars began to appear through the haze, Elias Thorne simply sat on the cooling earth and breathed, grateful for the air, grateful for the silence, and grateful for the chance to fight again. He helped Thomas to his feet, and together they walked back toward the camp, leaving the field to the ghosts and the memories. The drums of war echoed in their minds, a rhythm that would never truly fade, but for now they were alive, and in the midst of death, that was the only victory that mattered. The reprieve following the victory on the plains was short-lived, for the war was a hungry beast that demanded to be fed constantly, and the regiment was soon on the march again, moving south toward a fortified position known as Iron Ridge, which stood like a sentinel overlooking the river supply lines. Elias Thorne walked with a heavy tread, his boots worn thin by the miles of rocky road, his mind occupied not with the glory of the past battle, but with the daunting task that lay ahead, for Iron Ridge was bristling with British cannons that had been pounding the continental positions for weeks. The heat of the summer had intensified, turning the air into a suffocating blanket of humidity that made the simple act of breathing a struggle, and the men moved in a daze, their uniforms stained with sweat and dust, and their canteens dry. Elias looked at Thomas, who was marching beside him, with a grim determination, the boy's face now hardened by the things he had seen, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the dark shape of the ridge loomed against the sky. They knew that taking the ridge would require a direct assault, a suicide mission in the eyes of many, but it was a necessary evil if they hoped to break the stalemate and open the river for the starving army. As they camped that night in the shadow of the ridge, the fires of the enemy burned brightly above them, mocking their darkness, for General Washington had ordered a blackout to conceal their numbers. Elias sat in the dark, cleaning his musket by feeling his fingers, tracing the familiar contours of the wood and steel, finding comfort in the weapon's solidity. He could hear the low murmurs of the men around him, voices filled with fear and bravado discussing the coming dawn and the hell that awaited them. Captain Hayes moved among them, his arm in a sling from a wound received in the last skirmish, but his spirit unbroken, offering words of encouragement that sounded hollow in the heavy night air. "We go at first light," Hayes whispered to Elias, crouching beside him in the dark. "We have to silence those guns, Elias, or the entire army will be cut to ribbons." Elias nodded, unseen in the gloom, understanding the stakes, for if they failed, the revolution might die on the slopes of this cursed hill. "I am ready, Captain," Elias said, his voice steady though his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Get some sleep," Hayes said, clapping him on the shoulder, "for tomorrow we walk into the fire." But sleep was elusive, a fleeing phantom that refused to settle on Elias's weary mind. He lay on the hard ground listening to the crickets and the distant rumble of thunder that might have been a storm or might have been the enemy testing their range. He thought of Sarah and the cool breeze of the Shenandoah evening, the smell of the river and the sound of Silas laughing, and he held onto those memories like a drowning man clutching a lifeline. The darkness slowly gave way to a gray pre-dawn light, a ghostly illumination that revealed the mist clinging to the base of the ridge. The order to assemble came in whispers passed down the line from man to man, and the regiment rose like a waking giant checking weapons and tightening straps. There were no bugles this morning, no drums to announce their presence, only the soft shuffle of feet on the grass and the labored breathing of frightened men. They moved out of the tree line and into the open field that separated them from the enemy fortifications, a stretch of ground known as the Devil's Apron because it offered no cover and no mercy. As they reached the midpoint of the field, the sun crested the horizon, blinding them with its brilliance, and at that moment the ridge erupted. The British had seen them. A thunderous roar shook the earth as the cannons on the heights unleashed their fury, sending iron balls screaming through the air to plow furrows in the ground and in the ranks of the advancing men. The silence of the morning was shattered, instantly replaced by the cacophony of war. Forward Hayes screamed, waving his sword with his good arm into the fire. Men into the fire. Elias broke into a run, his head down, his body bent low, moving toward the smoke and the flame. The air around him hissed with the passage of musket balls, a deadly swarm of angry bees. He saw men falling to his left and right, their bodies broken by the cannon fire, but he did not stop. He could not stop because momentum was their only armor. Thomas was running beside him, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror, but he kept pace, his legs pumping, fueled by adrenaline. They reached the base of the slope where the ground rose sharply upward, a steep incline covered in loose shale and thorny brush. The cannon fire could not reach them here, but the British infantry lined the earthworks above, firing down in disciplined volleys. Elias scrambled up the slope, his hands grasping at roots and rocks, pulling himself upward inch by inch. The heat was intense, not just from the sun but from the burning brush set alight by the explosions. The smoke was thick and acrid, stinging his throat and watering his eyes, reducing visibility to a few yards. He fired his musket at a red coat that appeared through the haze, seeing the man jerk back and disappear. Then he reloaded while sliding backward on the loose rocks, his movements frantic. "Keep moving," Elias yelled to his squad. "Do not stop or you are dead." They clawed their way up the hill, the enemy fire raining down on them like hail. A grenade tumbled down the slope, bouncing off a rock and landing near Thomas. Elias reacted on instinct, diving forward and shoving the boy aside just as the grenade exploded, sending a shower of dirt and shrapnel into the air. Elias felt a sharp pain in his leg, but he ignored it, scrambling back to his feet and pulling Thomas up. "Go!" Elias roared, pushing the boy upward. They reached the first line of abatis, a tangle of felled trees with sharpened branches designed to impale the attackers. The men hacked at the wood with axes and bayonets, desperate to clear a path while the British fired into the mass of struggling bodies. It was a slaughter, a meat grinder of flesh and wood. Elias found a gap in the branches and squeezed through, tearing his uniform and his skin, but he was through. He turned and fired, killing a British sergeant who was directing the defense. Then he reached back and hauled Thomas through the gap. They were inside the first perimeter now, but the main fort lay ahead, a wall of logs and earth-spitting fire. The noise was deafening, a continuous roar that drowned out all thought, leaving only the primal instinct to kill. Elias led the charge toward the wall, his bayonet fixed, his eyes burning with a cold fury. They reached the wooden palisade and began to boost each other up, climbing over the shoulders of their comrades. Elias vaulted over the top, landing in the dirt on the other side, and immediately engaged a British soldier in hand-to-hand combat. He parried a bayonet thrust and drove the butt of his musket into the man's face, sending him crashing to the ground. The fighting inside the fort was chaotic and brutal, a swirling melee of blue and red coats. The air was filled with the smell of blood and black powder and the screams of the dying. The fort was catching fire now, the wooden structures ignited by the wadding from the cannons, and the flames roared upward, adding their heat to the inferno. It was truly into the fire, a descent into a burning hell where shadows danced and men died. Elias fought his way toward the cannon battery, the objective of their assault. He saw the gunners trying to reload the massive weapon. turning it toward the interior of the fort to fire on the intruders. Stopping them, Elias screamed, rallying his men. They charged the gun crew, firing their pistols and swinging their muskets like clubs. Thomas was there in the thick of it, fighting with a courage that belied his years, striking down a gunner who was reaching for the linstock. They overwhelmed the crew and spiked the gun, driving a metal file into the touch-hole to render it useless. One by one the guns fell silent as the Continentals swarmed over the position. The British commander, seeing that the fort was lost, ordered a retreat, and the remaining redcoats fled down the backside of the ridge, leaving the burning ruins to the victors. Elias stood amidst the carnage, his chest heaving, his uniform torn and bloodied, his face blackened by soot. He looked around for Thomas and found him sitting on a crate, staring at his hands, which were shaking uncontrollably. "Are you hurt?" Elias asked, kneeling beside him, his voice raspy from the smoke. Thomas shook his head slowly, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. "I am alive," Thomas whispered. "I do not know how, but I am alive." Elias put a hand on the boy's head as a gesture of comfort in the midst of the horror. "You walked into the fire, Thomas," Elias said, "and you came out the other side tempered like steel. The victory was theirs, but the cost was high. The fort was a burning pyre, the flames consuming the dead and the wreckage alike. The heat was unbearable, forcing the survivors to retreat to the edge of the earthworks where the air was slightly cooler." Elias looked out over the valley from the heights, seeing the river winding below, a silver ribbon of peace in a landscape of war. He felt the pain in his leg now, a throbbing reminder of the grenade, but he pushed it aside, knowing there were men in worse shape who needed attending. He spent the next hour helping the surgeon tie tourniquets and carry the wounded away from the fire. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of angry red that matched the fires of the fort, Elias sat on a rock and watched the flames die down. He felt a deep exhaustion settling into his bones, a weariness that went beyond the physical. They had taken the ridge, they had opened the supply line, but he knew that this was just one hill in a range of mountains, one fire in a world ablaze. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the locket, checking to make sure it was undamaged. It was warm to the touch, reflecting the glow of the embers. He opened it and looked at the faces of Sarah and Silas, their images untouched by the smoke and the blood. They were his anchor, his reason for walking into the fire and coming back out. Captain Hayes approached him, his sling bloody but his face triumphant. "You did well, Thorne," Hayes said, his voice thick with emotion. "You and your men saved the day. We did what we had to do." Captain Elias replied, closing the locket and putting it away. Hayes nodded, looking at the burning fort. "They will think twice before challenging us on this ground again," Hayes said. "Perhaps," Elias said, "but there is always another hill, Captain, always another fire." They sat in silence, watching the sparks rise into the night sky, joining the stars. The Battle of Iron Ridge was over, but the war continued, a relentless march toward an uncertain future. Elias closed his eyes for a moment, letting the darkness behind his eyelids block out the glare of the flames. He could still hear the screams and the roar of the cannons echoing in his mind, but underneath it all, he could hear the beating of his own heart, steady and strong. He was alive. He had walked into the fire and survived. And as long as he had breath, he would keep walking, keep fighting until the day he could turn his back on the flames forever and walk home to the cool green peace of Oakhaven. He opened his eyes and stood up, the pain in his leg, a dull ache now. "Come, Thomas," he said to the boy who was dozing nearby, "let us find some water and wash this soot from our souls." They walked away from the burning fort, leaving the fire behind them, moving toward the cool dark of the woods where the rest of the regiment was gathering. The night air felt like a benediction on their scorched skin, and for the first time that day Elias felt a flicker of peace. They had faced the worst the enemy could throw at them, and they were still standing. The fire had not consumed them, it had forged them. And tomorrow they would be ready to face whatever new hell awaited them on the road to liberty. The smoke from the burning fort of Iron Ridge had finally settled into a grim layer of soot that coated every leaf and blade of grass in the surrounding woods, turning the vibrant green of summer into a mournful gray that matched the spirits of the men who camped in its shadow. Elias Thorne sat on a fallen log near the edge of the field hospital, his leg wrapped in a bandage that was already seeping red, a throbbing reminder of the grenade that had nearly ended his war. The air was thick with the copper smell of blood and the sickly sweet scent of gangrene mingling with the smoke, and the sounds that filled the clearing were the stuff of nightmares. The low moans of the dying and the sharp cries of men under the surgeon's saw. This was the price of redemption. The butcher's bill that had to be paid for the victory on the hill, and Elias felt the weight of it crushing down on him more heavily than any pack he had ever carried. He watched the surgeons moving between the rows of wounded, their aprons stained dark, their faces masks of exhaustion and professional detachment, and he wondered how much more of this a man could see before his soul simply shriveled up and died. Thomas sat beside him, his eyes fixed on the ground, his hands clasping and unclasping around a tin cup of water that he had not drunk. The boy had survived the fire of the assault physically intact, but something in his eyes had broken and some light had been extinguished by the horrors of the hand-to-hand combat inside the fort. Elias reached out and placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder, feeling the tension in the boy's frame, a vibration like a plucked string that refused to stop humming. "Drink the water, Thomas," Elias said softly, his voice a gravelly rumble amidst the cries. "Drink it and wash the taste of the smoke from your mouth." Thomas obeyed mechanically, lifting the cup to his lips and swallowing, but his eyes never left the patch of bloody grass at his feet. "I killed a man." Elias Thomas whispered the words, slipping out like a confession. "I looked into his eyes and I drove my bayonet into his chest, and he looked just like me. He was no older than Silas." Elias felt a pang of sorrow so sharp it almost stole his breath, for this was the moment he had feared, the moment when the war stopped being a cause and started being a personal tragedy. "It is war," Thomas Elias said, his voice firm but gentle. "We do not choose who stands before us. We only choose to survive so that we can go home to the ones who need us." But the words felt hollow even to his own ears, a flimsy shield against the moral injury that was festering in the boy's heart. Elias stood up, testing his weight on his injured leg, gritting his teeth against the flare of pain, and limped toward the hospital tents, needing to be doing something other than sitting and thinking. He found a bucket of fresh water and a ladle and began moving among the wounded, offering sips to men whose throats were parched by blood loss and fever. He moved from pallet to pallet, disregarding the color of the uniforms, for here in the House of Pain there were no patriots or loyalists, only broken men. He stopped beside a young soldier whose chest was heavily bandaged, his breathing a wet rasping sound that signaled the end was near. The boy opened his eyes, which were a startling clear blue, and looked at Elias with a mixture of fear and confusion. "Is it morning?" the boy asked, his voice barely audible. "It is morning," Elias lied, gently wiping the sweat from the boy's forehead with his sleeve. "The sun is coming up and it will be a warm day." The boy smiled faintly, a ghost of a smile that made him look like a child. "My mother will be worried," he whispered. "She told me not to go." Elias's heart clenched, and he thought of Sarah and the fear that must be living in her heart every hour of every day. "Your mother loves you," Elias said, holding the ladle to the boy's lips. "She knows you are brave." The boy took a sip and then closed his eyes, his breathing hitching once and then stopping altogether. Elias stood there for a long moment, watching the stillness settle over the young face, and he realized with a start that the boy was wearing a red coat. He was the enemy, the oppressor, the tyrant's tool, and yet in death he was just a boy who missed his mother. Elias felt a tear track through the soot on his cheek, a drop of moisture in a desert of ash. This was the redemption he realized, not the victory on the hill or the taking of the cannons, but the preservation of his own humanity in the face of such inhumanity. To see the enemy and still see the man holding the hand of a dying boy regardless of the flag he served was the only way to save his soul from the darkness. He covered the boy's face with a blanket and moved on, his limp more pronounced now, his body screaming for rest, but his spirit finding a strange kind of strength in the service of mercy. He worked until the sun was high in the sky, until the last of the water was gone and the surgeons had collapsed from exhaustion. Then he returned to the log where Thomas was still sitting, the cup now empty at his feet. Elias sat down beside him, the silence between them comfortable now shared. "I helped a British soldier die today," Elias said, quietly staring at the tree line. Thomas looked startled out of his trance. "Why did Thomas ask, his brow furrowing? "He would have killed you yesterday." "Because yesterday is gone," Elias replied, "and today we are just men, and if we lose our mercy, Thomas, then we have lost the war, no matter who wins the battles." Thomas looked at him for a long time, the confusion slowly fading from his eyes, replaced by a dawning understanding. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of wood he had been whittling a rough figure of a bird. "I made this for Silas," Thomas said, handing it to Elias to take it. "Maybe it will bring him luck." Elias took the wooden bird, feeling the smoothness of the wood where Thomas's knife had carved away the rough bark. It was a simple child's toy, but at that moment it felt like a holy relic, a symbol of the innocence they were fighting to protect. "Thank you, Thomas," Elias said, tucking the bird into his pocket next to the locket. "I will give it to him when we get home." The mention of home seemed to lighten the air around them, pushing back the gloom of the hospital. They ate a meager meal of hardtack and dried beef, the food tasteless but necessary, and then Captain Hayes approached them, his face gray with fatigue but his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. "We move out at dusk," Hayes said, his voice rasping. "We are leaving the wounded with the surgeons and the rear guard, but the main force is pushing south toward Yorktown. The British are retreating and General Washington wants to trap them against the sea." Elias nodded, feeling a weariness that went down to his bones, but he stood up, ignoring the protest of his injured leg. "We are ready," Captain Elias said. Hayes looked at the bandage on Elias's leg and frowned. "You can stay with the wagons," Thorne. Hayes said. "You have done enough. No one would blame you." "I cannot stay," Elias said firmly, looking at Thomas, who was standing beside him, his musket in hand. "I made a promise to see this through, and I made a promise to watch over the boy. I will walk." Hayes nodded, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "Then ready your men," Hayes said. "We march into the endgame." As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the field of misery, the regiment formed up. The ranks were thinner now, gaps where friends used to stand, but the men who remained were hardened, tempered like iron in the fire of the ridge. Elias took his place at the head of the squad, his leg throbbing with every beat of his heart, but he forced himself to stand tall. He looked back at the hospital tents where the dead lay in rows waiting for burial, and he said a silent prayer for the boy in the red coat and for all the sons who would never go home. The price of redemption was high, paid in blood and tears and the fracture of the soul, but as the drums began to beat a slow, steady rhythm, Elias knew that they had paid it. They had looked into the abyss and they had not blinked. They were moving toward the final confrontation, toward the sea where the destiny of a nation would be decided. Elias touched the locket and the wooden bird, two talismans of love in a world of hate, and took the first step. The pain in his leg was sharp, biting, but he welcomed it, for it was a reminder that he was still alive, still feeling, still fighting. He walked with a limp, a hitch in his stride that would stay with him for the rest of his days, a physical mark of the price he had paid. But his head was high and his eyes were clear. Beside him, Thomas marched with a new resolve. The ghost of the boy he had killed laid to rest by the wisdom of his sergeant. They marched into the gathering twilight, leaving the ridge and its ghosts behind, moving toward the coast where the smell of salt water would replace the smell of smoke. The road was long and the night would be dark, but Elias Thorne did not fear the darkness anymore, for he carried his own light within him, a flame fueled by love and mercy and the unbreakable promise of return. He listened to the rhythm of the marching feet of 1,000 men moving as one, and in that sound he heard the heartbeat of a new country, a nation being born not in the halls of palaces but in the dust of the road and the hearts of broken men who refused to yield. The price had been paid, and now they were coming to collect the prize, which was not gold or land but the simple sacred right to live in peace. And as the stars came out one by one guiding them south, Elias whispered the name of his wife and his son into the night wind, sending his love ahead of him like a scout to prepare the way home. The air at Yorktown smelled of salt and gunpowder, a potent mixture that coated the throat and stung the eyes as Elias Thorne crouched in the muddy trench waiting for the signal that would mark the beginning of the end. It was the hour before dawn, the time when the world was suspended in a gray limbo between night and day, and the silence that hung over the battlefield was heavy with the weight of held breath. For weeks they had been digging, closing the noose around the British army, inch by bloody inch, moving the earth with shovels and picks under the cover of darkness, while the artillery thundered overhead, shaking the ground like a trapped beast. Elias checked the bandage on his leg, which had hardened with dried blood and dirt, but the pain had receded into a dull throb, a background noise to the pounding of his heart. Beside him, Thomas leaned against the wall of the trench, his face smeared with clay, his eyes closed in a moment of stolen rest, but his hand gripped his musket with white-knuckled intensity. They had come a long way from the cornfields of Oakhaven through the snows of the starving winter and the fires of Iron Ridge, and now they stood at the edge of the sea facing the final bastion of the enemy. The objective was Redoubt Number 10, a fortified position that bristled with abatis and cannons blocking the completion of the second parallel and the final bombardment of the British inner defenses. General Washington had ordered a dawn assault with a bayonet charge with unloaded muskets to ensure surprise and silence, relying on cold steel and courage rather than powder and ball. Elias looked down the line of men, seeing the grim determination on their faces. He knew, as well as his own faces that had aged 10 years in the span of one. There was no whispering now, no bravado, just the quiet acceptance of men who knew that some of them would not live to see the sun rise fully. Captain Hayes moved through the trench, his sword drew his voice a low rumble. "Remember, men," Hayes said, stopping near Elias and Thomas, "we do not fire until we are inside the walls. We move fast, we move silent, and we do not stop for anything." Elias nodded, meeting the captain's gaze and seeing the flicker of fear that even the bravest men carried into the dark. "We are ready, Captain," Elias said, his voice steady. Hayes squeezed his shoulder, a gesture of brotherhood that transcended rank. "God be with you, Thorne," Hayes said, moving on down the line. Elias turned to Thomas, nudging him gently. "Wake up, Thomas," Elias whispered, "the time is near." Thomas opened his eyes instantly, clear and alert, the sleep shedding from him like water. "I am awake." "Elias," Thomas said, "I was just praying." "Praying is good," Elias said, checking the lock of his musket one last time, ensuring the flint was removed as ordered, "but keep your bayonet sharp, for God helps those who help themselves." The sky to the east began to lighten, turning from black to a bruised purple, a signal that the curtain was rising on the final act. A single rocket arced into the sky, trailing a tail of sparks, and exploded with a dull thump, the signal to advance. Up Elias hissed, scrambling out of the trench and into the open ground of the no man's land. The squad followed him, moving like shadows across the uneven terrain, their boots making sucking sounds in the mud. They ran low and fast, eyes fixed on the dark outline of the redoubt ahead, which loomed like a sleeping monster against the lightening sky. For a moment there was only the sound of their breathing and the thud of their feet, and Elias allowed himself to hope that they might reach the walls undetected. But then a sentry on the parapet shouted a challenge, a sharp cry that shattered the silence. "Werda!" the sentry screamed. There was no answer, only the surge of the American wave. The redoubt erupted in fire. Muskets flashed from the firing steps, sending balls whistling through the air, but the Continentals did not stop. They did not return fire, they simply ran harder into the teeth of the storm. Elias heard the grunt of a man hit to his left, but he did not look. He kept his eyes on the abatis, the tangled barrier of sharpened logs that protected the fort. Sappers moved forward with axes, hacking at the wood with frantic energy chips flying like shrapnel. Elias roared, pushing Thomas toward a gap that had been cleared, "Move or die." They squeezed through the breach, the thorns tearing at their uniforms, and scrambled up the earthen walls. A British soldier appeared above them, thrusting a pike down with a savage yell. Elias parried the blow with his musket barrel and lunged upward, his bayonet finding its mark. The soldier fell back and Elias vaulted over the parapet, landing inside the fort. It was chaos inside, a swirling melee of bodies in the confined space. There was no room for formation, no room for tactics, only the brutal intimacy of the knife and the bayonet. Elias fought with a mechanical efficiency, parrying a sword stroke from an officer and driving his shoulder into the man's chest, knocking him backward. He spun around looking for Thomas and saw him backed against a gun carriage, fending off two redcoats with desperate swipes of his weapon. Elias roared a sound of pure primal rage and charged, slamming into one of the attackers with the force of a battering ram. The redcoat went down and Elias drove the butt of his musket into the man's jaw, silencing him. The second soldier turned his eyes wide with shock, seeing the demon that had descended upon them, and hesitated for a fraction of a second. It was enough. Thomas lunged his bayonet, catching the soldier in the shoulder, and the man dropped his weapon, clutching the wound. Behind them, more Continentals were pouring over the walls, a blue tide that overwhelmed the defenders. The British fought bravely, knowing that this was their last stand, their backs to the river, but they were outnumbered and outmatched by men who were fighting for their very existence. The air was thick with smoke and the metallic smell of blood, the ground slick with gore. Elias slipped on the wet earth, falling to one knee as a British grenadier loomed over him, raising a musket to club him. Elias braced for the blow, but a shot rang out, a sharp crack that sounded out of place in the bayonet fight. The grenadier crumpled, falling sideways. Elias looked up to see Captain Hayes standing on the parapet, a smoking pistol in his hand, his face a mask of fierce triumph. "Get up, Thorne," Hayes shouted, "the day is ours." Elias scrambled to his feet, adrenaline masking the pain in his leg. The British resistance was crumbling, the defenders throwing down their weapons and raising their hands in surrender. "Cease fire," Elias yelled, his voice cracking. "Cease fire." They yield. The fighting died down slowly, the momentum of violence hard to arrest, but eventually the redoubt fell silent save for the heavy breathing of the victors and the groans of the wounded. Elias leaned against the captured cannon, his chest heaving, sweat dripping from his nose. He looked around frantically for Thomas and found him sitting on a powder keg with his head in his hands. "Thomas," Elias called out, moving toward him. "Are you hurt?" Thomas looked up, his face streaked with tears and blood, but he shook his head. "I am whole, Elias," Thomas said, his voice trembling. "I am whole." Elias pulled the boy into a rough embrace, holding him tight, feeling the solid reality of his life. "We did it, Thomas," Elias whispered into his hair. "We took the wall." As they stood there, the sun finally broke the horizon, a brilliant sphere of gold that flooded the battlefield with light. It illuminated the scene of carnage, but it also illuminated the flag that was now being raised over the redoubt, the stars and stripes snapping in the morning breeze. A cheer went up from the main lines, a roar that rolled across the fields like thunder, thousands of voices joining in a chorus of victory. The British in the main town were trapped, their outer defenses gone, their escape route cut off by the French fleet in the bay. It was over. The last stand at dawn had broken the back of the empire. Elias walked to the edge of the parapet and looked out toward the town of Yorktown, seeing the white flags beginning to flutter from the rooftops. He felt a sudden, overwhelming exhaustion, a draining of the tension that had held him together for years. He sank down onto the earth, stepped his back against the wall, and closed his eyes, letting the sun warm his face. He thought of the long road that had led here, the mud and the snow, the hunger and the fear, the friends lost and the innocence stolen. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the locket, his fingers trembling as he opened it. Sarah's face looked back at him, unchanged by the years that had ravaged him. "I am coming home," Elias whispered to the picture. "I am finally coming home." Thomas came and sat beside him, the wooden bird in his hand. "Is it true, Elias?" Thomas asked, looking at the white flags. "Is it really over?" "It is over, son," Elias said, opening his eyes to look at the boy who was now a man. "The fighting is done." They sat there for a long time, watching the sun climb higher into the sky, listening to the cheers of the army and the silence of the guns. The drums of war were silent, replaced by the beating of their own hearts. Later that morning, General Washington rode out to inspect the redoubt, his tall figure imposing on his white horse. He stopped near Elias and Thomas, looking down at them with eyes that had seen too much. "You fought well, men," Washington said in his voice grave and resonant. "You have secured the liberty of this nation." Elias stood painfully, coming to attention. "We fought for our homes," General Elias said simply. Washington nodded, a shadow of a smile touching his lips. "Go home then, soldier," Washington said. "Go home and live in peace, for you have earned it." The general rode on, and Elias looked at Thomas with a genuine smile breaking through the grime on his face. "Did you hear Thomas?" Elias say. "We are going home." They spent the rest of the day burying the dead, both friend and foe, in the soft earth of the redoubt, marking the graves with simple wooden crosses. It was a somber task, but a necessary one, a final act of respect for the men who had shared this last stand. As evening fell, the army began to celebrate, fires springing up along the lines, fiddles playing and rations being shared freely. But Elias and Thomas sat apart on the wall of the redoubt, watching the moon rise over the ocean. The air smelled of salt and victory, but also of profound sadness, for the end of a war is also the end of a way of life. They were soldiers no longer, they were farmers again, builders, fathers, sons. The transition would be hard, the silence of peace deafening after the roar of battle. But as Elias looked at Thomas, he knew they would be all right. They had survived the fire and the ice, the betrayal and the blood. They had paid the price of redemption, and now they held the prize in their hands. A future. Elias took the locket and the wooden bird and wrapped them in a piece of cloth, placing them deep in his pack. He would not need them as talismans anymore, he would have the real thing. He put his arm around Thomas's shoulders, and they sat there, two silhouettes against the moon, watching the tide roll in, washing the blood from the sand, cleansing the world, preparing it for a new day. The last stand at dawn was over, and the first day of the rest of their lives had begun. It was a day of promise, a day of liberty, a day that had been bought with the highest currency. And as Elias closed his eyes, he could almost smell the cornfields of Oakhaven and hear the voice of his wife calling him in for supper across the quiet valley. The war was history now, but their story was just beginning. The guns had fallen silent at Yorktown, and the great armies that had churned the earth into mud and blood were slowly dissolving like the morning mist under the rising sun of a new era. Elias Thorne stood by the roadside, his pack heavy on his shoulders but his heart lighter than it had been in years, watching the columns of men drift away, not as soldiers marching to war but as fathers and sons walking back to the lives they had interrupted. The road north was a ribbon of dust winding through a landscape that was already beginning to heal, the grass growing over the scars of the trenches and the birds reclaiming the skies where smoke had once choked the air. Elias turned to look at the battlefield one last time, committing the scene to memory, not the glory of the surrender but the quiet dignity of the empty field where the price of liberty had been paid. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Captain Hayes standing there, his uniform faded and patched but his bearing as upright as ever. "You are heading home," Thorne Hayes said, his voice soft with the shared weight of their journey. "I am Captain Elias." Shifting the strap of his musket, which now feels like a relic of a bygone age, "I have a promise to keep." Hayes nodded, extending a hand which Elias grasped firmly, feeling the calluses of a man who had wielded a sword for a cause greater than himself. "You are the rock of this company," Elias, Hayes said. "Never forget that what we built here will stand long after we are dust." They parted ways, then Hayes riding toward the capital to help build the peace, and Elias turning his face toward the Shenandoah Valley, toward Oakhaven and the life that waited for him. Thomas walked beside him, silent and contemplative, the boy who had left home seeking adventure now returning as a man who understood the cost of it. They walked for days, their boots raising little puffs of dust, sleeping under the stars that seemed to shine brighter now that the smoke of war had cleared. They passed through towns where the people came out to cheer, offering them fresh bread and cool cider, their faces filled with gratitude, but Elias found it hard to meet their eyes, for he knew that the true heroes were the ones who would never walk this road again, the ones buried in the shallow graves at Iron Ridge and the frozen hollows of the winter encampment. As they reached the crossroads where the path to Thomas's village diverged from the road to Oakhaven, they stopped, the silence between them heavy with the sorrow of parting. Thomas looked at Elias, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I do not know how to be a farmer again," Elias Thomas said in his voice trembling. "I do not know how to hold a plow after holding a musket." "Thomas," Elias said, placing his hands on the young man's shoulders, "just as you learned to be a soldier, the land is forgiving. It will heal you if you let it." Thomas nodded, taking a deep breath, and then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small knife, the one he had used to whittle the bird. "Will you come to visit me?" Elias Thomas asked. Elias promised, "One day when the harvest is in I will come, and we will sit by the fire and we will not talk of war." They embraced, then a fierce hug between two men bound by blood and fire, and then Thomas turned and walked away, his figure growing smaller in the distance until he disappeared around a bend in the road. Elias stood alone for a long time, feeling a piece of himself walking away with the boy, but he knew that this was the way of things, that paths diverged and life moved on. He turned and resumed his journey, his pace quickening as the landscape became more familiar, with the rolling hills of the valley welcoming him like old friends. The leaves were turning gold and crimson, the colors of autumn painting the world in fire, a gentle fire that warmed the soul rather than consuming it. He reached the ridge overlooking Oakhaven just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the valley. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat. The farmhouse stood exactly as he remembered it, the chimney puffing white smoke into the cooling air, the barn standing sturdy against the backdrop of the woods, the fields of corn harvested and the stalks standing in neat rows. It was a scene of such profound peace that Elias felt his knees go weak. He walked down the lane, the gravel crunching under his boots, a sound that he had dreamed of 1,000 times in the dark trenches. The dogs heard him, first barking a warning that turned into yelps of joy as they recognized his scent, bounding down the path to greet him, their tails wagging furiously. Elias knelt to pet them, burying his hands in their fur, letting their unconditional love wash over him. Then the door of the farmhouse opened and a figure stepped out, wiping her hands on an apron. Sarah. She stood frozen on the porch, shielding her eyes against the setting sun, trying to make sense of the silhouette coming down the road. Elias stood up and took off his hat, the evening breeze ruffling his hair, which was grayer now than when he had left. Sarah called out, his voice cracking with emotion. She gasped, a hand flying to her mouth, and then she was running down the steps and across the yard, her feet flying over the ground. Elias dropped his pack and his musket and ran to meet her, catching her in his arms, lifting her off the ground, spinning her around as she buried her face in his neck, sobbing his name over and over. They stood there in the fading light, holding on to each other, trying to bridge the gap of years and distance with the sheer force of their love. I promised, Elias whispered, burying his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of lavender and flower. I promised I would return. You kept it, she sobbed, pulling back to look at his face, tracing the lines of fatigue and the scar on his cheek with trembling fingers. You kept it. Then another figure appeared in the doorway, taller and broader than Elias remembered. Silas. The boy had become a man, his shoulders wide, his face set with a maturity that spoke of the burdens he had carried in Elias's absence. Father Silas said, his voice was deep and resonant. Elias released Sarah and stepped toward his son, seeing the reflection of his own youth in the boy's eyes. Silas, Elias said, gripping his son's arms, feeling the strength in them. You held the fort. I did my best. Silas said, his eyes shining. I tried to be the man you wanted me to be. You are, Elias said, pulling him into a hug. You are more than I ever was. They walked into the house together, leaving the musket and the pack in the dirt, for they had no place in this sanctuary. The kitchen was warm and filled with the smell of stew and fresh bread, a sensory overload that made Elias dizzy with happiness. They sat at the same table where he had made his midnight promise and ate together, the conversation flowing haltingly at first and then with a rush of words as they tried to fill in the blank pages of the last few years. Elias told them of the winter and the battles, sparing them the gory details, focusing on the friendships and the hope that had sustained him. He took out the locket and placed it on the table, the metal gleaming in the candlelight. This brought me home, he said softly. It was my compass in the dark. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out the wooden bird that Thomas had carved. And this, he said, handing it to Silas, is from a friend, a young man named Thomas who wanted you to have it. He said it would bring luck. Silas took the bird, turning it over in his large hands, marveling at the delicacy of the carving. I will treasure it, Silas said, placing it on the mantel next to the clock. The days that followed were a blur of rediscovery. Elias learned the rhythm of the farm again, his hands remembering the feel of the axe and the hoe, his body slowly shedding the tension of the soldier. He walked the fields with Silas, listening to his son's ideas for new crops and better irrigation, realizing with a swell of pride that the farm had not just survived but thrived under the boy's care. Sarah and he fell into a new rhythm, a deeper, quiet love born of separation and reunion. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the stars and simply holding hands, needing no words to express the gratitude that filled their hearts. But Elias knew that he was not the same man who had left. The war had changed him, carved away the softness and left a core of granite. He would wake sometimes in the night, sweating and reaching for a weapon that was not there, the sound of the drums echoing in his ears. Sarah would be there to soothe him, her voice a balm that chased away the nightmares. It is over, she would whisper, it is over, you are home. And slowly the nightmares faded, replaced by the peaceful dreams of a man at rest. Winter came and went, a gentle season of snow and silence that felt like a rest rather than a struggle. Spring followed, bursting with life, the valley turning green and vibrant. News came from the capital of a constitution being written, of a new government formed by the people and for the people. Elias read the newspapers with a sense of awe, realizing that he had helped write those words with his blood and sweat. He was part of something larger now, a strand in the tapestry of a new nation. Years rolled by, turning into decades. The sapling oak tree by the creek grew into a mighty giant, its branches spreading wide to offer shade to a new generation. Silas married a girl from the neighboring farm, and soon the house was filled with the laughter of grandchildren. Elias grew old, his hair turning white, his movements slower, but his back remained straight, the posture of a man who had stood on the wall. He spent his days sitting on the porch whittling toys for his grandchildren, telling them stories not of the killing but of the courage of the men who had frozen in the snow and marched into the fire so that they could play in the sun. He became an elder in the town, a man sought out for his wisdom and his calm. People would come to him with their disputes and their troubles, and Elias would listen, his eyes seeing past the petty grievances to the heart of the matter, offering counsel that was fair and just. He was a living monument, a testament to the generation that had birthed the country. One crisp autumn afternoon, Elias walked up to the ridge overlooking the valley, the same spot where he had paused on his return so many years ago. He leaned on his cane, his breath coming in short rasps, for his heart was tired now, having beaten for so long and through so much. He looked out over the land, seeing the patchwork of farms and the smoke rising from a dozen chimneys in the town of Oakhaven, now bustling and prosperous. He saw the road winding north, the road he had walked with Thomas, and he wondered if his friend was still looking at the same sky. He felt a profound sense of completion. The work was done. The seed of liberty they had planted in the blood-soaked earth of Yorktown had grown into a mighty tree, and its roots were deep and strong. Elias sat down on a large flat stone that jutted out from the earth, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. He thought of the title of his life, the chapters written in struggle and joy. He thought of the gathering storm, the midnight promise, the shadows and the silence, the treason and the drums, the fire and the redemption, and the last stand at dawn. It was a good story, and he decided a story worth telling. He took out the locket which he still carried every day and opened it. The pictures were faded, now barely visible, but he did not need eyes to see them. He saw Sarah young and beautiful. He saw Silas as a boy. He saw Thomas and Hayes and the boy in the red coat. They were all with him, a legion of ghosts who kept him company. He closed the locket and held it tight. He looked at the stone beneath him, weather-beaten and enduring, and he realized that this was his legacy. Not a statue in a square or a name in a history book, but this land, this peace, this family. It was a legacy carved not in marble, but in the living stone of the country itself, in the hearts of the free men and women who walked the earth. Elias Thorne closed his eyes, a smile touching his lips. He could hear the drums again, but they were not the drums of war. They were the heartbeat of the land, steady and strong and eternal. He listened to the rhythm, letting it lull him, letting it carry him away. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in a blaze of glory one last time. And in the silence that followed on the ridge overlooking the valley of his ancestors, Elias Thorne finally went home, leaving behind a legacy that would stand as long as the stone endured, a legacy of blood and liberty and a promise kept.